Hi everyone, my name is Lizzie Chan, and I am a member of the CPR Institute's Young Leaders in Alternative Dispute Resolution Steering Committee. I am delighted to host today's episode of our Corporate Counsel interview series. Y-ADR seeks to educate the next generation of young leaders on the full spectrum of dispute prevention and resolution mechanisms, and to provide an insider's view into how CPR's community of corporate counsel, law firm counsel, external counsel, and other experts in the field are using dispute prevention and resolution techniques to manage conflict to enable purpose. As part of this goal, in this interview series, we will ask corporate counsel to share their perspectives on dispute resolution mechanisms and their advice for young practitioners. Today, we welcome Timothy Shaw, who is the former Vice President and Chief Ombudsman of Pfizer based in New York. Tim, we are so happy to have you with us today.
Well, Lizzie, thanks so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
My first question for you today is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to work at Pfizer?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So after graduating from, I went to law school here in New York City. I went to Fordham, and after graduating from law school, I went to work at a law firm up in Boston, Massachusetts. Was there for a couple of years where I practiced labor and employment law. I then relocated back to New York City, my home, and worked for another firm here in New York for a couple of years before moving in-house with Pfizer. I think as a young lawyer, as many young lawyers, I had, working in-house was always something that I had thought about doing. So this wonderful opportunity came up at Pfizer to work in their legal division in their labor and employment law group. And I had a wonderful experience there. And I actually did that for probably about 5 or 6 years. And during that period of time, I was actually approached by the business side. And I had an interest in getting more involved in the business rather than just doing the legal work. Oftentimes, when you're called in as a lawyer to do the legal work, you're fixing a piece of a problem, but you're never involved in the bigger picture. So I definitely had a desire to be more involved with the actual business. So I was presented with a very attractive offer to move over to the human resources function for one of our business groups. And I did that. And it was a big change of career for me, and a lot went into that decision, but it was a new opportunity and I found it very exciting. So I was in the HR function for one of our business groups, and then actually moved around to a couple of other of our groups just to get the experience, because Pfizer at the time was much more diversified than it is now and had a lot of different business groups. So I worked for several of them, and then sort of came full circle, and I was asked to be the head of human resources for Pfizer's legal division. So it was like coming back home, but in a different capacity. So I jumped at the opportunity. I think that was always in my mind, my dream job. So I did that for several years and then wanted to try something new. So at the time, Pfizer was expanding its compliance function, and we were really building that function and doing a lot of really interesting things there. So I was approached about coming over to the compliance division. Again, a major career change for me, but I was ready for one. So I went to the compliance division and I was head of our US investigations group. And again, very different kind of work, but I loved it and learned even more about the business from a different perspective. So I did that for a couple of years. And then one day our chief compliance officer sort of knocked on my door and said, "Hey, we're thinking about starting this new function called the Office of the Ombudsman, and your name came up as somebody that might be interested in working on that for us." So I had some familiarity with what an ombudsman was. I'll be honest, I wasn't completely certain, but it sounded intriguing to me. And the most intriguing part about it was that it was going to be a function that I could build, I could create it. That was my, the task that I was given was to really create this function for the organization. So I jumped at the opportunity, and for about 6 months, I spent really just sort of designing the program. Pfizer obviously is a global organization. At the time, we had about 100,000 employees. So I had to figure out what would work best for us. So I did a lot of benchmarking with other large organizations. Unfortunately, maybe we'll talk a little bit about this just with the ombuds function in general. Ombuds functions are not that common in corporate America. They very much are in educational institutions, but not so much in corporate America. So I didn't have a lot from which to choose from. So I met with a bunch of different folks and ultimately put together a program that I thought would work well for us, for Pfizer. And it presented that to the board. They loved it and we launched. And then for the next 7 years, I spent just growing that function. We launched initially in the US, and then we expanded throughout the world, and ultimately took about 5 years before we were fully global and we were available to every Pfizer employee across the globe. So that was kind of my beginnings. When I started out, I never thought that I would end up doing that, but again, it was an opportunity that was presented to me, and I felt very fortunate to have that opportunity.
Would you be able to tell us about day-to-day work of being an ombudsman?
Yeah, great question. And again, when I first took it on, the first thing that I realized is there's a lot of misperceptions out there about what an ombudsman is. So what I had to do was really educate folks within our organization about what an ombudsman is, but more importantly, what it is not is what it came to be. So really what it is, and this is, I'm talking about an organizational ombuds, right? Because there are several different types of ombuds, but when you have a function like this within a corporate entity, it's considered an organizational ombuds. And our program, like many others, we ran our program pursuant to the standards of practice and code of ethics of the International Ombuds Association. And they have very clear guidelines as to how a program needs to be established and run our program. And basically what it means is that the program needs to be independent, it needs to be neutral, obviously needs to be confidential, and it needs to be what they call informal. Those are the basic parameters of an ombuds program. And what really, the huge benefit to having an ombudsman in a corporate setting is that, as I'm sure you know, under the basics of employment law, whenever an employee comes forward to the company, to anyone, whether a manager, a supervisor, HR, legal, when he or she comes forward with an issue or a problem, the company is then on notice of that issue and potentially has an obligation to investigate, depending on what the nature of the issue is. And that starts a whole process, right? Oftentimes, and it's been found through research, a lot of employees are reluctant to come forward because they don't want to start that formal process. They're having a problem or an issue, but they're concerned about starting that formal process. So oftentimes they won't say anything, and then the problem gets worse and then often becomes a bigger problem. The beauty of an ombuds program is that when someone comes to an ombudsman, because they are considered independent from the rest of the organization, notice to an ombudsman is not notice to the rest of the organization. And that is quite powerful, because what it allows us to do is to work with the individual one-on-one to give them the tools that they need in order to address whatever issue or problem that they're having. Now, if their issue is one of, say, like sexual harassment, obviously our job becomes getting that person to a place where they feel comfortable coming forward and putting the company on notice of that issue, because that issue does need to be investigated. But as an ombudsman, we cannot do that investigation, right? Because we have to remain neutral. So our job, again, is to get the individual to the appropriate person within the organization so that a proper investigation can be done. And it's a really effective way of dealing with employee issues, resolving them at a much more informal, and much lower level, much more informally, and hopefully resolving them before they get to be a bigger issue. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And the Office of the Ombud sounds like such an effective and innovative way to avoid disputes, but also to deal meaningfully with people's grievances. And on this point, I understand you've looked into restorative justice and its application in your work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was always intrigued by the whole concept of restorative justice. I had done some research in the area and attended some seminars on it, and I found the principles of it really compelling. And as an ombudsman, I was looking for ways that we could possibly incorporate that into our practice. But the decision that I ultimately came to, unfortunately, is I didn't feel comfortable that we could do that within the parameters of an ombuds program, because I felt it might step over that line of neutrality just a little bit too much. So while we did look at it, I did look at it for Pfizer, we ultimately did not adopt a program like that, because we just felt it was really sort of going beyond what would be appropriate for us to do. We did right before I was leaving Pfizer, probably about a year before I left, we did launch a mediation sort of component to our function, which we had just started to try out, which we had some early successes with. But restorative justice, unfortunately, we're still a ways away from that. I'm not familiar with companies that are using restorative justice within their organizations. I think it's a powerful tool, and again, of great interest to me. So hopefully somebody will continue to kind of look at that as a way of dealing with employee issues, because you do, whenever you have an issue, particularly between an employee and a manager, oftentimes that relationship gets fractured in the course of of dealing with those issues. And then those folks have to go back to work oftentimes and work together. And I don't think that we do a lot in helping them sort of move forward with that. And I think that's something like at least the principles of restorative justice or something like it could really help in a corporate setting to kind of mend those fences, if you will, so that folks can work more effectively going forward after having addressed, a potential issue between them.
That's really interesting. And just for our audience who may not be familiar with the principles of restorative justice, what do you see as the key tenets of restorative justice?
Well, again, the thing that is most compelling to me is sort of that mending process, right? Because oftentimes people feel, something has happened and they feel they have been injured by that. And there are those resulting feelings as a result of that. So if you can find a way to repair that, to me, that is a really, really important component of sort of the moving forward piece. And oftentimes the piece that we don't look at in dispute resolution. We resolve the dispute at hand, but then we don't look at the going forward piece. So I think, again, some of the principles of restorative justice could be very valuable in looking at that going forward. And for a corporate organization, that is really important because, again, those folks are going to have to continue to work together in most circumstances.
Thank you so much for sharing interesting insights into your role at Pfizer. I'd like now to ask you about your advice for young practitioners in alternative dispute resolution, especially those who are looking for a career in-house.
Yeah, so the in-house question is something that I get asked about all the time, being in-house counsel. And I know when folks, as with myself, when I was in law school, I had a great interest in going in-house. And I will tell you, my view over the years has evolved. And I do think while, for me, it was a great career path, I do think that any young lawyer does need to spend some time, in my view, in a law firm to get to build those basic skills in order to bring those forward into a corporate setting. I don't know that, at least at Pfizer, and I think we're not that different from other corporate entities, we're just not set up for training in that training for young lawyers. And although we may have programs and whatnot, I don't think corporations do a good job of training young lawyers. And I really think you need that basic training in order to do well. I will tell you, and I have a perfect example of it at Pfizer, we always had a summer program. We had summer interns that would come in and work at our legal division they were in their third year of law school. But we never offered them full-time employment after that, after they then graduated. So somebody had the thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could bring these folks right in from law school and then we could sort of train them to be the lawyers that we want them to be, like a pharmaceutical lawyer. So we did launch a pilot program one year, and we did hire a number of our interns that had been with us in the summer. We hired them into our first year class and brought them right into the legal division. Unfortunately, I will say they did not do well. Because again, we were not equipped to give them the basic training that they needed in order to become good, strong lawyers. So the program did not last very long. And unfortunately, those who participated in it were left in a not great position because now they were a couple of years out from law school. And we worked with them to try to kind of make things better for them and try to get them into other employment situations. But I think it proved to us that, at least for us, that you do need that basic training of a law firm to really build the skills that a young lawyer needs in order to be successful in a corporate environment. Because in a corporate environment, you're dealing so closely with the business and with clients. And again, it's just not the place, I think, my personal view, just not the place to learn those basic skills. So my advice to young lawyers when they ask me is I always encourage them, look, going to a law firm may not be your first choice of what you want to do, but I do think it's a necessary step in your career path in order to get to where you want to be. And you can do it, maybe spend 2 or 3 years. With Pfizer, we usually recruited folks who were probably 6 or 7 years out. But I think in 2 or 3 years, perhaps you can gain enough of those skills where you can begin to look for in-house work. And then I think you just bring so much more to the table and are so much more valuable and will be much more successful in your career there.
This is really helpful for a lot of external counsel there. Reaching that 6 to 7 PQE stage will be looking for options. So it's really useful to have your advice on timing. Well, it remains for me to thank you for your time today and for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it. And many thanks to our audience as well for tuning in.